Welcome to the James Bond Book Club. Hosted by me, John Bleasdale. Hello everybody and welcome to the James Bond Book Club. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and James Bond fan, and I usually say my name is Bleasdale, John Bleasdale, but I've given up a little bit on that gambit. And I am joined by Killick, Eon Killick. There you go, I'm back. Lovely to have you, Ian.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me, John. It's lovely to be here, and particularly to talk about my favorite Bond book.
On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But first of all, Ian, you're a film lecturer and you're a filmmaker. What have you been up to recently? I believe you've got a short film, The Bunker, which is currently doing the festival circuit.
Yes, my producer, Anna McNutt, who I've worked with for many years now, and we made this film, The Bunker. We sort of shot it and filmed it and then did all the post-production sort of around about December, January this year. I was the writer-director, she was the producer, and we've currently got it out on the festival circuit in the short film category. And it's a particularly short film. It's 7 minutes, so it's sort of the definition of nice and tight. And we're doing fairly well so far. So fingers crossed, we're getting some good European festivals. We've had some British ones. We've got a couple of American ones lined up. I think that one of us is hoping we'll be able to get to in October. So we've had a good response. We're very pleased, and we're hoping, and as ever, you know, in any country it's difficult, but we're hoping we can sort of lever that into developing a feature film for it. So that's what we've been working on mostly, the two of us over the summer.
Have you got a feature film script sort of developed and ready?
Yeah, the script is done. The script is done. It's never really done. So we're on the second. So I wrote the first draft in sort of March to April, May. Then the second draft was sort of May, June, and the third draft is now with Anna. She's having a look at it, and then she's taking a pass, and then we're going to see if we can sort of present it to some companies, some of whom may have seen the short already. So the short, I think this is true for a lot of filmmakers. I think the short is a sort of calling card, I guess, to show maybe a degree of competence, and then hopefully we can sort of lever that into getting the feature. So yeah, the feature's been plotted out and written, but we're on probably the third draft now. I imagine of many.
Excellent. But today we're here to talk about James Bond, and as you said, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is one of the most successful James Bond novels Ian Fleming wrote. It was coming after perhaps one of the least successful novels he ever wrote, which was The Spy Who Loved Me, but we have discussed that in another episode. It was certainly one that I feel he had a rebound. But what was your experience of reading this novel? And then, generally speaking, how did you get into Bond? What's your history with Bond?
Well, my history with Bond, probably like a lot of people of my age, started with the films. So it would have been, I think I remember seeing the trailer for The Man with the Golden Gun, but I think I was too young to be taken. So Bond for me started in the movies. I think 77, I went to see A Spy Who Loved Me. And then obviously I have the same history with most people with Bond. It's the movies first. But my experience of the Bond novels came actually a lot later. It was 2004. And
oh, wow.
I can't remember what Bond movie it was. It may have been the last Brosnan one, Die Another Day. But I got the feeling then Bond was kind of finished. It was done. I think that was a lot of feeling for a lot of. So I thought I'd give the books a try. So I went back and read all of the books back to back in kind of one big blast over the summer. I was lecturing, I had a bit of time off, so I read them in a very condensed period. So it's about 20 years ago. I think, like the films, John, they vary. You know, some for me worked, some worked less so. Though I would say, even if they didn't work, they're still always fascinating. I'd still read them. But for me, the three that absolutely leapt out, and oddly enough, I think these are the three best films as well. So I don't know if that's a discussion point. But the three that leapt out for me were Casino Royale, From Russia with Love, and at the top, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. There was just something about that book that felt like maybe, again, you mentioned that maybe he felt he was on the rebound here. And it did feel like it. It's, to me, such a good plot. It has, like anything, it has its flaws and it's got its difficulties and things that don't always work. But alongside From Russia with Love and Casino Royale. I just felt it was the one that was kind of the most outlandish plot, but the one that was had the most energy. I think that was my experience of it. Fascinating book.
Yeah, and I think you get a real sense that James Bond in this novel comes out as a much clearer character than perhaps he's been allowed to. Although I'm surprised at how much of a character he actually is. You know, I've talked in earlier episodes about how this Ian Fleming's own point of Bond is an empty vessel, he's a cipher, and all this sort of stuff. It strikes me now more and more as misdirection. I feel Bond is a character from Casino Royale on, and here we have a connection with Casino Royale because in this book we learn that Bond has been going to visit Vesper Lynd's grave every year.
That's right. And I haven't read the book for 20 years, so I reread it a while back in preparation for this, and I'd forgotten that. You know, you do get, and I'd forgotten that the opening is, I think I'm right in saying this. I'm just checking my notes. The opening is set back in, is it Casino Royale? It's set back in the same place, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's in
Yeah.
the he's
And I'd kind of
revisited.
forgotten that. Yeah. And it's really interesting to go back and reread it again. The opening chapters have this wonderful sense of reflection and reverie, and sort of it feels like you're almost like in a sort of floating memory. There's something, and again, I'd be interested to know what you think about this, John. There's something in the writing in those opening chapters that really feels like a kind of folding of time. It's like, and Fleming, in some ways, I can see what he's saying, that he doesn't think Bond is much of a character. I think he doesn't write a great deal of internalism for Bond, but I still feel I know Bond because of the actions and the things that he does. You know, watching Tracy on the beach. And I just get the feeling of Bond in a real reflective mode. I used to say going back to Vesper's grave, revisiting Casino Royale. So it's almost like this book feels like the tail end of something that began in Casino Royale.
He goes back to Royale. I mean, I've got the book open in front of me, and he talks about how he had come a long way since then, dodged many bullets and much death, and loved many girls.
Mm.
But there had been a drama and a poignancy about that particular adventure that every year drew him back to Royale and its casino, and to the small granite cross in the little churchyard that simply said Vesper Lynd R.I.P. And that's kind of, it's funny because there's always this idea, I think, in Bond of surfeit, of him eating too much, drinking too much, smoking too much, having too much libido, compared to the opposite of that, which is M's sort of sitting in an office and not doing anything and drinking terrible wine and being angry all the time. He's out in the world doing this thing, but at the same time, there's this sort of return that he has where he keeps having to go back to these. You know, I mean, this is sort of like his loss of innocence with Vesper Lynd.
Yeah.
That's where he learned to grow up.
And again, it's interesting. It's lovely hearing you go back over those words again, and you are reminded that although he may be writing not necessarily always in the first person, you do feel that this is Bond in reflective mode. You know, going back to that which made him what he was, and it is such a beautiful opening I think that's why the book and maybe the film to an extent as well, it has a reflective sort of melancholy about it. I think particularly in some of these opening stages. And this is Bond. I mean, we're talking 1962 now, so Bond is possibly in his late 30s, I'm guessing, something like that. You know, so he's, you know, I don't know what the life shelf is, you know, for spies back then, but he's probably aware of not necessarily his own mortality, but the end of this kind of life, which possibly is why I don't want to rush too far ahead in the book, but this is maybe why he rushes into marriage again. He wants to sort of settle down and secure. And you almost feel the opening is almost like teeing that up. Bond in reflective mode.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, one of the big differences between the carelessness of the films and the books is that there is something of the soppy puppy about Bond in the books, that every woman he meets he kind of falls in love with, and yeah, okay, it might just end in a relationship, but he's kind of careful that he often refers back to the women he's had relationships with, and he'll often say, oh, so and so is now has 2 children and he's over there, and it's like, wow, you're keeping track of them. You know, you're
Yeah.
still interested. You're not You're not this indifferent sort of love machine. The sex that you're having has consequences for you. And in the case of, say, Moonraker, he definitely wants more out of the relationship than, I mean, he's kind of cuckolded in terms of Moonraker
Yes.
and in terms of Vesper Lind here. There's another man that he doesn't know about.
Yeah, because I think, isn't it in the end of Moonraker, Gala Brand, I think he attempts to go and see her. It's been a while since I read it, but she says, "Well, no, I'm marrying this other guy
Yeah.
from Special Branch." And it's fascinating to go back and sort of read something like on a Majesty's Secret Service. I love your phrase, "He's a soppy puppy," because actually rereading this, you go, "Yeah, he kind of is." I had to sort of check. I was reading it again just briefly last night. I think he meets Tracy twice, and on the third time proposes to her. So yeah,
Yeah.
this is a very this is like a real old softy who just kind of is a bit of a soppy, maybe slightly naive romantic. And I'd forgotten that. It's been 20 years since I read them. And I think because the popular culture of the films embeds itself in your brain so much, you forget, no, that's not what he's like in these books. Not at all.
Absolutely. And I think the same goes for the violence. There's an element that he's much less of a sort of killer than he is in the
Mm,
films. He's much more thoughtful. He definitely has to provoke the baddie into trying to kill him, but he can't draw first. He's that, even
mm.
though he's 007, he's licensed to kill, he's supposed to be an assassin. And yet he never in any of these books just shoots someone in the back of the head. He considers it, but he can't do it. I mean, there are several books which would finish on page 50 if he was a better assassin than he is.
Well, I think in this book, again, we'll chat about it as we go through, but I think he kills only one person. And that's slightly, in the spur of the moment rather than cold-bloodedly. It's kind of more of an act of defense, I think. I think that's it. So yeah, it's markedly different from what my memory is of these books. So yeah, a lot lighter and certainly not the assassin that I remember. It's more of a sort of, again, reading this one again, he feels like a sort of slightly reluctant bureaucrat than a killer.
I liked what you said earlier as well about the sort of the way time is folding in this and the way he's looking,
Mm,
and he maybe has a sense of his own mortality, because there has been in earlier books the sense that he's almost racing death to his retirement. It's sort of like, can I get myself killed before I retire, and then I won't have to face retirement? And a long life isn't what I'm after. I'm after an exciting life and then a painless death, hopefully at some point
mm,
in the near future. And in a sense, that's sort of projected onto Tracy, who even today, this feels kind of like a radical thing of he's watching. I mean, we start with this kind of almost like this painting of him sitting at the seaside watching Tracy going towards the sea, and we find out in flashback that he's met her already, and he feels she's going to kill herself and he wants to prevent that.
and again, it's that lovely folding of time where you actually start off with him watching her, but you don't know why, and then we go back to the reasons why. And remind me, John, does that kind of folding of time happen much in the other books? Because it certainly seems very specific to the opening of this. It doesn't. After that, things become a lot more linear. But these opening chapters feel like almost waking up from this sort of dream, and it's almost like a memory of Tracy and why he's doing these things. Does that crop up in many of the other books, John?
Yeah, he definitely uses the flashback on many an occasion as a way of
Mm,
sort of starting, in medias res, if you like, of, he'll be on a mission, like Live and Let Die, for instance. He starts in New York on a mission and then it flashes back
right.
to London for the briefing. So he'll often start in the action and then flip back to the briefing, which won't be done in the films. In the films, you very rarely, I don't think you ever have a flashback in the films. Oh no, Casino Royale, the new one.
And the film of, I suppose technically there's one in the movie of A Majesty's Secret Service where Lazenby's looking out the window and you get a little flashback in one of the windows of Tracy being pulled out the snow.
Ah,
It's like a
yeah,
little,
that's true. Yeah, that
I
is
don't know if that
true.
class is the flash, but they're the only two I can think of.
In the movies, they sort of translate that literary technique into sort of having a pre-titles sort of closing of another mission before we get to
Mm,
the. But it's a similar sort of thing. Let's start with something exciting, and then we can have Doctor Exposition turn up in the form of M, and explain what the next mission is going to be.
I'm fascinated by what you say about this notion of the sort of suicidal Bond. And what book was it? Was it From Russia with Love, where we get this sort of psychiatric assessment of Bond, and they say he's prone to depression when not on duty? And did that crop up in From Russia with Love? I'm sure I remember that in one of the books.
Throughout the books, there's this sense that he has this thing called
Yeah.
acidy, which is the you know that he actually sort of diagnoses himself with, which is this sort of flabby lassitude that he has
Mm.
if he's not got a mission, if he's not, and he it's almost like some of the missions are a direct response to that, often, and as the books go on later and later, especially after this one. There's almost a sense that M is trying to give him missions to get him out of his lassitude or his depression.
Mm.
This book will get darker and darker, and the series from this point on will be very dark because of the events we're going to talk about soon.
And in some ways, though, Bond is a good diagnostician of his own melancholy. I think he probably knows he can't be sitting at home on a sofa at the age of 65 with a pipe, watching Coronation Street or listening to the Rolling Stones. He probably is aware of his own, again, I don't know what the word is, disassociation from life. This isn't a man who sits down and listens to records, particularly. This is a man who has a few friends, maybe in some gambling clubs, sleeps with married women and doesn't have much of a life. So you do get the sense, I think particularly this book, is a man who's aware that he probably doesn't want to get old. And maybe the proposal to Tracy is some kind of way of confronting that, of like, I need to have someone with me so I can get old.
In Thunderball, he's been literally diagnosed as like, you're really over the hill. And so there's a sense that his shelf life is uppermost in his mind, that he knows that this cannot go on forever. His body will not take it anymore, and his mind will not take it anymore. There's a psychiatrist who keeps being called in by M to give him a thorough checkup and a going over. And the psychiatrist is constantly saying, this guy's going to pop. One of these days, you're not going to be able to put him back together. And
Mm.
I'm fascinated by how much Bond is really an examination in mental health as well, which you would
Mm.
never, you would never think I'm going to read a James Bond novel and think about mental health while I'm reading it. But he is, it's much more consequential than well, obviously the films just have zero of that. There's occasionally Roger Moore will raise an eyebrow or Sean Connery will go but that's about it. It's very rare that they even get angry at something, and it's always slightly
Mm.
embarrassing in the films when they take something seriously to the extent that they spit something out between their teeth. They're not sort of Clint Eastwood.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I mean, this is someone who has to drink to sort of not confront himself. Somebody who has to be continually chain smoking, and even in Moonraker, does it take some speed or something? If I remember at some point in that, what was it, amphetamine?
Benzodrine and champagne.
Yeah, and the drinking seems to become, I do remember this from reading a while back, the drinking does seem to become more pronounced. So by the time we get to an Majesty Secret Service, there's a wonderful line where I think, Tracy said, would you like a drink? And he says, well, I'd like four, or something like that. And you go, wow, you're not just drinking to have fun, you're drinking just to kind of blot yourself out. So I think you're right about that mental health aspect. I think you can look at them in those kind of slightly disturbing terms of, this is a man really on the edge who I think is probably we don't really want to go necessarily into Bond's childhood. They don't do that particularly that much in the books, apart from after maybe in this one they do a little bit. But yeah, this is a man who just is not comfortable being at home in his own skin in any capacity, and needs all of these things like international flight, gourmet meals, copious amounts of cigarettes, and driving I think in this book they say 125 miles an hour at some point, which we'll come to, just to sort of, as you say, maybe live on the edge. And possibly that's what he maybe sees in Tracy, someone who is that much of a damaged soul as he is.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. I totally think that he's seeing a reflection and maybe somebody who's just like even a little bit more damaged than him. So he can go,
Mm,
okay, I can help you. And in helping you, I'm sort of helping myself. I'm showing myself to be a bit more in control than I actually am. And you mentioned earlier about him not having many friendships. Of course, as he tries to save Tracy, him and Tracy are both kidnapped by unknown ruffians, and
yes.
he is helpless. And I always think it's interesting when Bond is helpless because he's much more helpless than he is than you'd usually expect. He's much, it's really frequent in the films that it's like, well, nothing to do now until until this thing resolves itself. He's frequently passive. For someone who's supposed to be a secret agent, he's secretly he maybe his agency is so secret that I just can't see it. So I mean he even sort of thinks, oh, maybe I could escape if I sort of put a knife in the in the rubber dinghy or something.
He has a brief moment about considering a knife, but as you say, he kind of just sort of is quite passive. And which again is a fascinating thing reading this book again. You again, I really don't want to talk about the film too much if I can avoid it, but in the film, he's much more active. I'm doing this. Whereas you're forgetting in this, no, he's quite passive, He actually is bored of looking for Blofeld. He doesn't particularly want to do it anymore. And
Mhm.
I'd forgotten the passivity of it to an extent. He sort of reluctantly sent off to do things. And as you say, Goldfinger, I think, is probably the apotheosis of this. He just gets moved from one place to another and sort of reacts to things that happen to him rather than actively making the move along.
Yeah, I mean, I talked about this with Brian Baker on the episode of From Russia with Love as well. That he's sort of like in a train.
Mm,
He's in Turkey with Kareem, and he's looked after by Kareem for the whole thing. And from one situation to another, he's just being brought places. And essentially, he's also being brought places because the Russians are kind of baiting him into a trap, and he falls for it every single time. So there is this really weird thing which you know about the trap, and you're just watching him blithely wander into it without
mm.
much awareness that there even is a trap or even is any danger. And again, with this book also has an element of that, which we can go into a little bit later on when we get to Blofeld and his plan. But here, when he turns up at the at Draco's sort of hideout, there's this strange description of Draco that we have, which Draco sort of enters the pantheon of Bond sort of frenemies, sort of villains, people who should be on the other side of the law, but who, again, slightly puppyish, but Bond has a real takes a real shine to, and it's like, oh, this guy's amazing.
He is a wonderfully sort of playful character, the way he's
Mm.
presented. I love the line. Was it his face is like a walnut with a big smile on it, and it's just a wonderful small piece of writing. But I love that sense of a walnut with a smile in it, and you kind of get the guy's character in that one line. It's a wonderfully economical writing, and he is so playful. Again, a very serious villain, really, when you look at actually what he does. But he does come over as very playful, kind of lovable, almost counterpoint to M. It's like almost like a more lovable and affable father figure for Bond.
Definitely, I think that Draco is the drunk uncle to M's sort of austere dad. It's like, no, you can't, no, you can't. But when's Uncle Draco turning up? When he
Oh,
Uncle Draco will take me to the fair.
yeah, Uncle Draco lets us have chips.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. We don't have to eat lettuce with Uncle Draco. No, that's exactly it, I think. And it's interesting. I don't thought about this, but with Draco's proposal, which from a point of view of sort of gender is nuts, I want you to marry my daughter and give her a reason to live. It feels nuts as a proposal, but there's also a sense that this is another mirroring of the plot from Russia with Love, where basically they're saying you've got to go and make love to this defector so that she will smuggle out this machine for us. So you are
Mm.
basically something out of almost a James Bond porn parody. And here it's the same sort of thing. It's like, you're James Bonk for this one, and that's your mission. And if you want me to help you with Blofeld, then quid pro quo. Could you court Tracy? And it's Bond being, his sort of sideline in sexual athletics is actually being used and manipulated by the other characters.
That's a very good comparison to From Russia with Love, and I hadn't considered that, but yeah, because he turns down Draco's proposal pretty bluntly, despite the offer of was it a million, something like that.
Yeah, it's a million on the day of your marriage.
Yeah, but as the conversation sort of moves on over a couple of or two or three pages, he starts to realize actually I could get something out of this. I could find out where Blofeld is. So he does sort of agree, almost as you say, to sort of pimp himself out. And it is odd, isn't it? Because again, you don't feel the sense of that someone selling themselves sexually so much in the films, but it's certainly prevalent in this book, and particularly in this particular chapter. He agrees to it pretty quickly. Doesn't seem to have any qualms about it.
Well, there's a sort of Austin Powers, Roger Moore in The Spy Who Loved Me, the things I do for England.
The things yeah. Yes. I almost slipped into it then, but I promised myself I'd try not to do that too much.
You get one.
I'll get one. Okay, I'll do one at some point when it's appropriate. There's something I'd like to ask you this as well, John. As a writer yourself, what I'm fascinated about. This is something that I'd forgotten about coming back to this book. I think it has wonderful energy and a real, like, literally at the end of each chapter. Okay, here's a reason to go to the next chapter. So it's incredibly, I think, narratively taught. But, and it starts round about here, you get almost the journalist Fleming starting to kick in, where you get this very long kind of, and I felt quite sort of tedious page or so about the Union course, what it does and how it's mapped out. And that almost saying it derails it. I still love the books, but I'd love to know how you feel about those elements. Like later on, when Mark Antz talks about how he procures the helicopter for the raid, really long, almost piece of like journalistic prose that I wouldn't say it derails it, but I always find those things a bit odd. What did you make of those elements? I mean, do you think they add to the novel? Do they detract? I'd love to know your thoughts.
I think they go through the novels totally, and I think I can always
Yeah.
hear the sound of a pair of scissors and a pot of glue coming out as he cuts from something he's read somewhere and
Mm.
glues it into the book at the appropriate point. He does do research. He often would do research after having read the book. Sorry, after having written the book, and he would sort of like put a placeholder in and say, okay, I need 2 pages on this here, and I need a bit about heraldry that I don't know anything about. So I need to have a chat with my old friend from university and put that in there.
Yes.
And I think he does do that. Now, I think the what does that do in terms of a thriller writer? And I think there is an element where I think modern thriller writers like Lee Child are very conscious of doing this as well, and maybe influenced by Fleming in this, is the people who read thrillers, one of the joys you get out of them is that sort of like obscure knowledge you didn't know, and sort of the sense that the writer is in the know to a sort of closed world or criminal underbelly or just some technical information. So see Tom Clancy and his sort of techno novels where it's like, oh wow, is that how a submarine works? Is that how the upper echelons of the FBI work? Or as I say, Lee Child is full of factoids about this bone will
Yes.
break at this thing, and this has a melting point of such and such degrees, and and it can be incredibly, it's like a sometimes like a pedantic cousin, at a wedding, sort of putting you in a corner and
Yeah.
telling you all these facts. So it can, I think that is kind of one of the, I wouldn't say thrills of a thriller, but it seems to be like a qualification that thriller
Mm.
writers do to sort of ground what otherwise are kind of pretty ludicrous sort of adventure stories. It's like, no, you don't know about this, and this is really interesting, and that gives it a sort of flavor and a difference. So in Live and Let Die we find out about piracy and doubloons and stuff like that, and in this one we find out about biological warfare and Sardinian criminal gangs, and heraldry. I mean, it's full of sort of, if this was written
Oh yeah.
today, you would be, this is Wikipedia, isn't it? This bit's Wikipedia. He's gone,
Mm.
he's headed over. But I do think there is a thrill to it if done in a sort of a way which isn't too boring and, as you say, doesn't stop the narrative too much.
And I think what's interesting is, I suppose, we have to reflect on the time that they were written. As you say, learning about doubloons and piracy, and learning about biological warfare, or learning about, how does one procure a helicopter from a right-wing insurgency group in sort of Italy. Those are new things. So that aspect of them maybe being slightly plonked in is less jarring in the time. These are fast, like traveling on a plane. This is new. So maybe it's adding to that sense of the newfound knowledge and exoticism that surrounds these novels.
Being underwater, I mean, Thunderball has these diving scenes. Live and Let Die has a diving scene.
Yes.
The vast majority of the readership, they will never have that experience. It's not only like
No.
it won't happen anytime soon. It's like they will never have that experience. So it's almost like they're reading science fiction at that point.
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, we're talking about, we can't speak for the whole world here, but certainly the British readership, we're still in a sort of kind of the tail ends of a very austere period. The idea of even traveling abroad. So yeah, I think maybe looking back in the reality of that time, these things become more powerful, I think, and impactful, I think, for that sense. I think with the modern eye, as you say, I love that phrase there, to cut and paste. It always feels like it's been plonked in. It didn't detract from the narrative, but it just felt odd in a way that it wasn't seamlessly put in. But as you say, going back to the period of the time, this is probably outrageously fascinating stuff. And I love your phrase science fiction. I'd never looked at Bond through that prism, but it is there.
Oh, I definitely think there is sort of science fiction elements to all of the novels. Weirdly, maybe not Casino Royale, but there's always things that are on the edge of technological possibility. There's
Mm.
always a strange use of the natural world, which is seems to have seems to work in ways that the natural world sort of shouldn't work. Giant squids and that's something out of Jules Verne comes to mind. And even just the
I guess,
megalomania of the plots, people
yeah.
wanting to do things on a planetary scale. I think that's something that Ian Fleming really does bring to the spy novel. Is they're not novels about people. Well, some of them are. Some of them are novels with very low stakes, but others are, oh, we're going to actually set off a nuclear bomb here.
And in this book, we're going to use nature to turn against itself. We're going to use vaccines, or purported vaccines, viruses, but it's all about the natural world. And coming back to your point now, I've just realized this, coming back to this idea of science fiction, if you go back and actually look at this kind of massive, great, is it like a lorry that Draco, Marquand's Draco moves around in? I mean, it's fairly high tech, isn't it? He's moving around in a lorry that's got communication systems in it, it's got phones in it, but it's a big lorry, isn't it? I think he moves. Did I misinterpret that? But it is, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's his sort of mobile lair.
Yeah. And, that's kind of science fiction. I'm not saying ripped off, but what was that really terrible Die Hard film? The fourth one, where the villain travels around in a big lorry. You think, yeah, there's a sci-fi element to that.
He goes back to London and he sort of has this, Bond goes back to London and he has this idea. He's given this mission to,
Yes.
to go to Blofeld. And even here, the thing is very strange. This idea of the vanity of he wants to acquire for himself a foothold in nobility, but they need to check that his earlobes. He
Yes.
hasn't got any earlobes, and that is there's something really strange about this and really petty. But it also runs very consistently with Bond's own sort of racial ideas, shall we say, for that he's often talking about, oh, the closeness of somebody's eyes. Or who was the Italian, was it a phrenologist, or the guy who sort of catalogued people's faces, and it was literally, oh, so and so is a criminal type because their eyes are too close
Because
together.
of this. Well, yeah, I mean, Fleming does that a lot.
Lombardo, I think he was called.
Lombardo. Is that who it is?
I
Right,
think
right.
so, yeah.
But I think, yeah, Fleming's not averse to a bit of physical abnormality artist creating villainy. That seems to be a very recurring thing for him. We have is it the syphilitic nose of Blofeld in this
That's it.
particular book?
Yes, yes, that's right.
I love this part though when Bond's back in London and he's again, is he driving through Hyde Park and smells the burning leaves? And there's something about that. I think the line is he felt autumn and winter approaching. And again, you do wonder actually that the underratedness is not a word. Let me try that again. Actually, how I think that the lack of appreciation for sort of I think Fleming's writing. He's back in London. He's driving through Hyde Park. Quite why he's going through Hyde Park from Chelsea to Westminster, I don't know, but never mind. But you get the burning leaves and this sense of autumn and almost the autumnness of the character, maybe. I don't know what you think about. I really felt it in this opening bit. Yeah, there's just something about that, going from Chelsea and the burning leaves and the smoke and that sense of autumnalness that I just felt like Bond entering the final chapters of his working life or life, maybe.
I totally agree with you, Ian. I think there's a real, if I sort of close my eyes and think of why I am so attracted to these books time and time again, I read them as a child, I've read them 20 years ago, I reread them all. Because the ones that I'm rereading now all have the dates written in them from when I last reread them, and they're all sort of 2003 was the last time. I've got the open in front of me. It was 7th of May 2003. I finished on Her Majesty's Secret Service before finishing it, in my reread in 2024. So 11 years ago, I reread this. The thing that draws me back to them is exactly what you're talking about, is that autumn in Regent's Park with M behind his sort of leather door and the baize desk he has in front of him, and all those that to me, that sort of, what would you call it these days? That Scandinavian word, hygge, that sort of feel of coziness, hygge,
Yeah,
coziness of London. And it's like, why would you ever want to leave here? But then you're going to the Caribbean, you're going to you're going to all these other wonderful exotic places as well. But again, with this book, you've also got the feeling of the eternal return. He's always coming back to London, and even in his travels are actually not that far flung. He's going to Jamaica several times. He's going to France, as we've already established. He's been going back to France on an annual basis. He'll go to Italy a few times, but there are places he never goes, or he goes I think he goes to Russia once in the novels, which is right at the end of the novels, where you have the man with the golden gun, where he's been in Russia and it hasn't gone well.
That's right. And you only live twice. Is that China or no, Japan, wasn't it?
Japan, yeah.
Japan. So yeah, that's probably the furthest he goes, I guess. Yeah, but again, they're sort of few and far between. But his journey on this one, he doesn't go far. We go into sort of Switzerland, brief little forays in sort of Zurich and things like that. But again, not far. The choice, there's something about, again, I think this is why it's so pleasing to better talk about this, but there's something wonderfully even telling in the choice of the whole location for the mission is a cold, wintry place. It's actually, I think the coldest place is Sent. So again, you get that sense of, Bond in his autumn period, maybe for the first 5 or 6 chapters, then he's entering his winter period for the rest of the book. And it just seems particularly well chosen.
I just wonder if they'll ever do an old Bond, the way they did Logan, that they'll ever consider doing like a couple of films where he is actually, like one thing that has never happened with the James Bond franchise cinematically is they've never spun off. There's always been talk of doing a Halle Berry at the end of Die Another Day. They'll do it on Michelle Yeoh. There was some talk that her character was so exciting, but they've never done it. And then you sort of think, or the Tarantino wanting to do a period version of Bond, and I think they're way too protective to do any of those sort of things. But you do sometimes think there are bits of the universe that I'd quite like to see a Blofeld movie where you just Despicable Me style. You just see the same. I mean, Blofeld appears in 3 books. This is the second book he appears in. He's an interesting character in and of himself. He's he actually has an arc, which many of the villains obviously don't. And a lot of the villains you can they have outlandish names and they have different sort of physical appearances, but you can sort of mix and match them. How different is Goldfinger from Scaramanga or from Mr. Big? They're
Mm.
different racially, but they're not different in terms of anything. But there are ones that are very distinct. I mean, I think Red Grant is a really
Red Grant is,
you know
yeah. I
is
mean, it's
unique.
absolutely, again, it'd be a frightening concept. I don't quite know how you'd make it, but a Red Grant film almost.
Yeah.
Quite how that would work out. But again, possibly the most fascinating of the villains, along with Blofeld, I think.
Oh yeah, I mean he's terrifying because he's essentially Dexter. He's essentially a serial
Yeah.
killer that they've decided we can use this guy and we can use an utter psychopath to do our bidding.
Mm.
Which is sort of what Bond is not, which is what Bond is constantly compromised by his humanity. If he was this cold killer, he wouldn't have so much trouble. He would be
Yeah. Yeah.
the books would be
Well,
shorter and he would be more
yeah.
successful.
Well, if we remind ourselves of the aim of the mission here, it's actually, it isn't that of the assassin. Mary Goodnight rings him up. He's sent to the College of Arms, and the mission ostensibly is, as you say, is to do one thing only, which is to sort of check the earlobes. But then after that, it's to try and get him down to off the mountain, just so as he can be arrested. That's
Yeah, so
it.
he can so he can be black bagged.
Yeah, and that's it. He's not being sent as a killer. He's, as I say, he's been sent to go undercover just to check the earlobes. That's it. So the license to kill isn't really even on the cards at this point.
Yeah, it's really a police operation. Sometimes he will characterize himself as I'm just some sort of policeman, but he goes up to the hideout undercover. I love this undercover bit because he's so
Oh
bad.
yes.
He's such a bad secret agent, James Bond. Because somebody says, "Oh, Hillary," and he's like, "Who?" And stops himself having to turn around and
Yeah.
see if they're calling someone behind him. Oh, me? Oh, yes, yes, of course. I am Hillary Bray. That is my, it's like you're a secret agent. You're supposed to be good at this. And he's
One of my favorite. Sorry, John, I butted in. Please.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
One of my favorite moments in Bond's initial, putting on the Hillary Bray disguise. This wonderful sort of tidbit when he's in, I think he's either in the helicopter and they're going off up into. So he's met Irma Bunt, the wonderful Irma Bunt, and she's taking him up in the helicopter. And I think it may actually just be before that, maybe when he's coming through the airport, probably searching for scrambled eggs as usual, where he actually realizes sort of about halfway through coming out of the airport that actually Hillary Bray, being the mountaineer that he is, probably isn't as posh as Bond thinks. So he swaps his Times newspaper for a Daily Express. And so it's like you didn't quite know who it was you were impersonating. So he quickly changes the newspaper just to something a bit more down market like the Express, which I thought was a wonderful little touch. And those are often my favorite moments in these books when the real world comes in. You'd never see in the film Daniel Craig or Roger Moore deciding what paper to pick up. And I think that's what separates these books, even though they're quite fantastical. These little moments, for me, root them in the real world. And Bond, as you say, he's a bit daft. You weren't quite sure whether you were posh or not as Hillary Bray. You kind of should have got that. At least think about that on the flight on the way over.
And I think there's the naivety that continues as we go on in the latter part of the mission when he comes back from Switzerland and he explains the whole plan and they're sort of saying, oh, to me it looks like he's doing a really good job because he's curing all these girls of, yes, we know he's Blofeld now and we know that he should be doing something about this, something nefarious, but as far as I can tell he's actually curing these girls of their allergies. So maybe he's turned over a new leaf. And these are the upper minds of the British Secret Service, and you just suddenly realize no wonder Burgess and McLean were never caught. This is the quality of intellectual interrogation that is taking place at the upper echelons of the British Secret Service. You could bowl these people over with the flimsiest cover story.
Oh, absolutely. Even Bond being sent on the mission, I think, if I remember rightly, M's quite disdainful of it. He says, well, it's almost a bit of business we've got to sort of take care of. There's no great sense of, well, hang on a minute. This man threatened nuclear Armageddon a couple of books ago. This is fairly serious stuff. So yeah, there's a real kind of sort of country club, almost, we're still the empire, so we don't need to do a great deal, really. We can just send a few people out to keep an eye on them. Surely that's fine. It is fairly ridiculous when we look at it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's like the amateur spy it's
Yes.
the professional spy has only been properly in place since the Second World War. So at this point,
Mm.
1961, you're talking about less than 20 years almost. So just over 20 years. Somebody like M, who is an old geezer, has spent the majority of his professional career sort of with the Navy and not caring about this sort of nonsense, this rot, as he would no doubt call it. And so he just can't get into the mind of someone like Blofeld wanting to do this kind of nihilistic, destructive
Mm.
harm. And he's and it's really interesting that actually this plot of On Her Majesty's Secret Service is kind of crops up more in the very recent movies. You've got things like Casino Royale, which talks about futures and
Mm.
when 9/11 happened, how certain shares, certain stock markets crashed and other ones made a fortune. And I think Quantum of Solace also has a sort of thing about financial dealings, which are much more similar
Yeah.
to what On Her Majesty's Secret Service is doing, which is like if we can make the crops fail, then we can manipulate the markets, and then we can make a load of money. And even terrorism, which is very much this book is using that as an idea, is much more feels much more modern and ahead of its time than some of the previous books, where the baddies were much more like Dr. No was much more like Fu Manchu or something like that.
Do you think there's something very specific also, John, in this, in the film, it's worldwide. But in this, he's targeting the United, well, actually, even England. It's not even the United Kingdom, is it? He's specifically targeting England. And, again, you're getting this sense of a country coming to the end of its empire. And this is actually the new world that's going to come in and actually kind of just knock it down a peg or two and drain it of whatever kind of success, as you say, financially it might have had left. Maybe not dissimilar. It's like From Russia with Love. The aim is to discredit one particular country, and in that case, it was maybe discrediting Britain morally, so it's showing a compromised Bond and Secret Service. But in this, you're kind of crippling the country financially. And again, I think, John, this comes back to that idea of you can almost imagine the reality of some bewildered old, Secret Service gents in armchairs, not quite knowing what to do with this.
Absolutely, and you've definitely got the sense that like the when was the Suez crisis? That
Is that mid 50s or is it 53?
56. 56 is the
Okay.
Suez crisis.
Yeah.
So this is 61. So you've already had Suez. So we're already second to the United States no longer think of us as this. There's no illusion of us being equals with the United States. That has long gone. The
Mm.
idea, the sort of Brexit idea, if you like, of our sustainability as an island, which post-war there was to some degree a sense that, oh, well, we survived the war, yeah, with the help of all these convoys. But there's a sense of like, okay, we could have our autonomy. Well, that's directly threatened by this kind of, plan.
Mm.
We wouldn't be a trading partner and we wouldn't even be able to feed our own people if this disruption takes place. On a more sort of psychological level, I would also connect it to Bond's own appetite and his love of eating. That he's
Mm.
let's hit Bond where it hurts in the
Yeah,
scrambled eggs.
in the stomach. Yeah. Well, the subject of eating, yeah, hit him where it hurt. I mean, the subject of eating is fascinating, isn't it? And again, because I read these 20 years ago, so it was quite an eye opener to go back to it. When you realize that there's a wonderful moment, I think it's about a third of the way through, or actually, it may even be when he's traveling and to Piscoria, where they actually say that Bond's tastes when he's back at home are quite primitive. And
Mm.
I think they say often when he's on his own, his housekeeper, I can't remember her name now, but what she'll prepare for him.
Is it Meg or someone like that?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
But he'll eat grilled soul. This is, I've got the line written down here. He'll eat something like grilled sole and potato salad. And you think, actually, I thought he was a real gourmand. And I'm just, and again, whereas you get the sense he's a gourmand when he goes traveling, he doesn't appear to be when he's back at home. I thought that was fascinating. I'd always remembered him as this great sort of Epicurean eater. But to suddenly hear that his sort of dinner back at home was a bit of like some cold cuts and some potato salad was really odd, really jarring.
Yeah, I mean, he goes for, when he's back at his office, he goes for the sandwiches in the canteen. And, his
Yeah,
only sort
yeah.
of gesture towards cosmopolitanism is that he doesn't like drinking tea. And even that is sort of like, you know, you could easily have made him, an absolute connoisseur of the finest Earl Grey rather than,
Mm.
tea's mud, get me coffee. It feels more like an
But
affectation.
I'm wondering though, because isn't it the case that again, one of the things that I'm fascinated is the link between the author and the character, and you got Bond eating kind of very kind of plain food. And am I right in saying is that was the case with Fleming, wasn't it? And I can't remember who it was. Was it someone like maybe Noel Coward or
It
someone who
was, yeah.
visited him, and they said, "Well, whatever you do, don't let them cook for you."
Yeah.
This guy, very grim. So actually, is it the case then that maybe Fleming, is that basic in his tastes, and it's only when we go to the exotic that we experience that real culinary delights. What am I right in saying that? Is that the case?
You're absolutely right, Ian. And I think this goes back
Right.
to the journalism as well. I think this is the journalist who, being a journalist myself, never pass up a free meal. But
Yes.
when you're on your own, it's cheese on toast.
Mm.
So I think this is Fleming would definitely right. He would have lots of correspondence with people, and it would be like, okay, where in Zurich, where could he eat, and what would he eat, and what kind of food, what would be the wine that he would have with that, and he would be getting that, and he would be filling in the blanks.
Mm.
He'd leave blanks in the manuscript. And he'd be filling them in with other people's knowledge as well as his own personal. He would go places, take notes, and use them. He would often do the journey that Bond was doing, or he would have gone on a journey and he would think, okay, I can use that journey for the book. I just
That's
need
a
to
good story. Yeah.
put this person here and that person there and give him a reason to be in those places. Yeah, yeah. I mean, so London, and you're completely right about Noel Coward. He was, I think, there was a thing about Fleming having like a local chef who would just burn everything and make everything very spicy to cover up how bad it was. And Coward was like, oh, you could at least have a decent cellar, and also, I mean, Fleming was kind of, I think there was an element that he was always financially struggling. He was always living above his pay grade, and
Mm.
the books weren't making as much money as you might imagine they would. They were successful relatively. Interestingly, and I think this is one of the reasons this book is much more energized than a couple of the preceding books. The film, while he's writing it, Dr. No is filming exactly the same time. So he's got Sean Connery and Ursula Andress and Terence Young coming to dinner. Hopefully, he's hired in some caterers um, while he's writing this. So he's getting a feeling. Okay, this might be the next film. This might be. I better up my game, and I'm going to get some more money. Some more money's going to come my way as a direct result of this. So I don't want to kill off my character just yet.
It must have had an impact, mustn't it?
Mm.
Because I was doing a bit of research in the run up to this, about, the film aspect of Fleming. And, I think some of the things I discovered that Moonraker, there was a concept this might make a better film. I think his publisher or his editor said that. And Thunderball certainly was with Kevin McClory and Stuart Whittingham, I think, was again intended to be a film. So again, yeah, it's interesting you say that he has a writer probably with a solid amount of income, but there was always an eye of how can we make movies out of this, to make this a bigger thing. And maybe that's where yeah, you may be right. Maybe that's where the energy comes into this book, because he knows this is becoming a. Would you think was this written after the film came out, or do you think was it during
It
that
it was
process?
during the actual process of the making the
Right.
film.
Yeah.
And so he really fancied Ursula Andress, and when they're in Switzerland and they go for the trip outside of Pisgloria, there's a bit where he spots Ursula
He
Andress. He goes,
spots her,
"Oh,
didn't he?
there's that film star, Ursula Andress."
There's
Oh.
the film star who I have just seen in a film that is being made. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, precisely. And just to go back a little bit to the to what you were saying about, him getting sort of some money from the books. He's definitely getting royalties. He's definitely getting good advances and
Mm.
things like that. But his expenses are huge. He's got a house in the West Indies, Goldeneye. He's traveling by air on relatively frequently,
Yeah.
and he's got a place in London. And he has to, and he's got a day job. He doesn't give up his day job. So you can imagine, and he likes the good life. He likes messing
Well,
around
he
with people like
does.
Noel Coward. So you imagine that his actual
Yeah.
bank balance takes something of a battering. Just imagine how much it would be relatively flying to the Caribbean 2 or 3 times a year.
Well, back then you must be talking about an incredibly expensive, endeavor.
Mm.
And I'm wondering to what extent he often reflected about he wasn't always enjoying writing these and was finding it difficult at some points. And you're wondering if maybe money was the motive, the enjoyment for him wasn't quite there. Maybe always, and maybe this is why this one I think feels particularly pertinent to me because it feels like that energy has come back. Oh wow, there is something successful happening here. There is something interesting going on, and I think that book does benefit. Well, repeating what you've just said, but yeah, the book does benefit from that global brand coming into place, I think. I was going to say, and of course, we get now with Sean Connery's casting in Doctor No, we get Bond and his Scottish ancestry comes into this book.
Absolutely, yeah, and Swiss. He's a Swiss mother
Mm.
and a Scottish father,
Scottish father, yeah.
and that sort of yeah, that characterization really sort of becomes more pronounced as we go on, and even physical description to some extent. And earlier as well, you mentioned something about, and I think Fleming gets this an awful lot, and I'm not in any way going to argue against it, but he uses physical deformity or physical scars or wounds as signs of villainy. But Bond himself also has a very prominent scar, which is not great if you're a secret agent, that you have a really
Mm.
clearly visible distinguishing feature, which comes up in some of the books where people say, "Yep, it's definitely him. Look at the scar." So
Yes.
that's a really interesting point that Fleming might use physical ailments and physical disfigurements as a sign of villainy, but his everybody is wounded in these books. Everybody is scarred. Everybody is visibly
Yeah.
scarred, if not from the Second World War, then from something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And even someone like M, there's a disdain for life. He gets offered a KMCG award or something,
Mm,
and in this book, and orders money painted to throw all the letters in the bin of congratulations. This is a damaged man.
yeah.
This is not a person happy in their skin. So yeah, that they're all physically and mentally scarred in some ways from the lives they've led.
There's no more damning characterization of M than the fact that he paints these flowers, and even Fleming,
Mm,
who is kind of promotes him, he sort of he creates lifeless watercolors of lilies, and it's just like,
mm.
geez, and it's not even he creates lovely paintings of flowers. It's like lifeless, the most human aspect of him as a person, the most sort of tender element of his is just actually a robotic thing to take his mind off time passing. Let's go on with the mission, because there's just so much that's fascinating. So we have hypnosis here, which again goes into something which is slightly, to my mind, a little bit science fictiony, paranormally. It's not going to be something that is in the it still has the sort of the sheen of a pseudoscience at this point, rather than anything solid, almost like prefiguring what's going to come out of the 60s. This is early 60s, of course, but we're
Mm.
going into an alternative. What was that CIA project where they all took acid and jumped out of windows?
Oh,
Do you know what
I
I mean?
don't
It's like
know.
the
Yeah,
K25 or something. It has some sort of numerical code. The
right.
K22. It's like the FBI's use of sort of psychedelic drugs. And anyway, that all that stuff is being used with on these girls to then do bioterrorism, as we perhaps will cotton on much earlier than contemporary readers of Ian Fleming. The real moral moment happens as well with he has a bit of nookie, which doesn't seem to
Yes.
worry him, even though his heart is still with Tracy, and he even kind of thinks about that in a way. He's sort of just like,
It's in reflection, I think a little bit.
there's a
Yeah.
little. He sort of thinks, yeah, she is what she'd want.
Yeah. 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 It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also, I'm trying to remember at this point, he's only spent is he met her twice, hasn't he? I think once at Casino Royale, they spend an evening together, and then they have, I think, a meal in a hotel, and then she goes to the psychiatric clinic in Davos, I think. So he's been with her twice. But nevertheless, you still get the sense he's kind of really taken with her. So as ever though, it does seem that yeah, he still sleeps with the woman, but there doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to bother him a huge amount. No. And is this what's the is it Ruby, I think, wasn't it, in the book? They seem to spend a lot of time whispering in the toilet, which I found yeah, because they go in there. That's right. Yeah. And excuse me. They go into the toilet in his suite to sort of avoid the microphones. And again, I can't think why. I always felt something slightly unsettling about that. Every time they go and have a hushed meeting, they go into the toilet. It's sort of very odd.
There's an odd thing about bathrooms in the 1950s and 60s, which there is
Mm.
definitely a thesis to be written. 1960, Alfred Hitchcock and Psycho, all that. Also, there's this really interesting scene where they're having a dinner together, and he's the only guy, and he sort of gets the party going by teaching them a game involving a cigarette, a coin, and
Yes.
a tissue paper. And it's like this to me is almost like James Bond is absolutely unable to stop playing games. It's got to be
Yeah. Yeah.
poker, it's got to be roulette,
Okay.
golf, or if there's nothing else around, give me a tissue, a penny, and a cigarette, and I'm,
Yeah.
you know,
I wonder if it also points to, possibly he doesn't quite know what to say to them. Yeah, there's a wonderful line. I made a note of it here, and this is sort of Bond's internal thoughts of these women, and I can't remember what page it's on, but I've got it written. It says the girls all seem to share a basic. No, the girls all seem to share a certain basic girl guidish simplicity of manners and language. So he's quite disdainful of them as company. So maybe he just needs to give himself and them a distraction to sort of almost like he needs to get through it somehow. He doesn't appear to think much of them as a
mm.
bunch.
He's kind of out of place as well, and he's supposed to be playing this
Yeah,
other character. I mean, I think the film does this very, very well, where you're
I
aware
think
of
so.
how uncomfortable Hilary Blair should be, and yet how much of a wolf in sheep's clothing George Lazenby actually is, and how the
Mm.
women have his measure. They know exactly who he is. You're not fooling anybody.
Yeah, and it's interesting they're not. And again, I'd be interested to see I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this. The women in this, and I felt also Tracy. It's odd. I felt I kind of knew them, but they didn't seem to be particularly well sketched. I'd love to know what your thoughts on that. I mean, the women, maybe because again, they're kind of more plot devices, so you're not expecting them to be deep. But Tracy almost felt a little bit surface. I don't know. What did you think, John?
No, I'd push back a little bit of that because I do think
Okay,
in contrast to Bond himself, the women tend to take the initiative much more, and they tend to be much
that's true.
more motivated. That you know what they want and why they want it. And even
Mm,
in terms of Tracy sort of falling for him, one way of looking at that is sort of as a woman sort of enraptured by him, but it feels much more like her making up her mind that she's actually, I'm going to embrace life. This guy's okay, and this guy's good for me, and this comes out much more when you have this thrilling escape, and I think it's a wonderful scene,
mm.
and the avalanche scene is really well done, and it's a really good action scene in a book, which is well worth noting that the reason you read these
I think
books is because you
yeah,
enjoy,
yeah.
you enjoy this kind of moment, and it was based on real life as well because Fleming, you know, purposefully went down a slope he shouldn't have been going down. He knew it was flagged as a dangerous avalanche route, and he did it anyway. And he kind of had an avalanche chasing him as a result, and got partially buried. So this is sort of has smacks of that real knowledge. And then you have him meet up with Tracy with this wonderful sort of coincidence, which feeds into the sort of fable of the book, the sort of sense of a princess and a prince. He goes to the castle, and there's an element of that to it. And he says, I'm in bad shape, Tracy. And she's like, don't worry, I'll take care of you. And immediately the agency is transferred to her. She's the one with the car. She's the one driving. She's the one taking him out. She's the one nursing him. He might start giving orders and everything, but he's really, almost literally in the passenger seat for much of the of that part. And it's her getting him, to the airport and getting him out of Switzerland.
No, that's actually very true. Yeah, looking back on it, that is very true. And coming back to those points you said about Tracy, again, in some senses, coming out of she's in Davos in the psychiatric sort of care, and she comes out almost kind of sort of a little bit more sort of supercharged. She is a changed woman, isn't she? She does take charge, and she does get him out of there. So yeah, that's actually very, very true. There is agency there, actually, now you say that. And I'd love to actually take that point, John, and come back to sort of Bond as an actual agent on the mountain top. How do we rate him in terms of his abilities as an agent and his abilities to sort of talk to Blofeld and kind of get what he wants? Where are we on that? Because I actually think on this one, he doesn't do a particularly bad job. It's only really bad luck when he gets spotted, when the clock starts ticking against him. But generally, I felt he inhabited his disguise and his sitting with Blofeld, I thought, fairly well.
Yeah, and he does the thing with the ruler, and he sort of steals the plastic thing that he's going to use to unlock the door, but realizes that they'll check, so he immediately says, "Oh, by the way, I took this thing because I need it as a ruler," and they're like, "Oh, okay,
Yeah.
I guess you're okay then."
Yeah.
So
And I
he's
like that part. I thought he's quite good at reading people. He kind of takes it, and then he's watching Bunt and he's watching some others, and he knows he's made a mistake, and he knows it fairly quickly. So I thought, okay, there's the intuitions aren't that bad.
But the thing that you say about the agent from the Swiss station, is it Station Z for Zurich, I'm assuming, who's been on an independent sort of, that Peter isn't talking to Paul, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing.
Yeah.
So they're on a separate investigation, and almost gets given away. And he had, well, very much gets given away, and he has to sort of say, oh, the guy was obviously crazy, and can't really do anything for him. And I feel that is a very moral, that's kind of one of the things that breaks him. That not
Mm.
only is he not this cold-hearted assassin, but he can't stand by and see people being killed with any sense of impunity. It's not like, well, it all goes with the business. It's like, hell, I should have been able to do something there.
Yeah, he does reflect on that,
Mm.
and he does sort of in the moment. Again, he does. I think he acts quite quickly, and he's quite quick at changing. Goes, no, no, this poor chap, deluded, obviously thinks I'm somebody else. But I did admire it as a plot device, because once that happens, you feel the chapters time is now ticking against Bond.
Yeah.
And again, I felt that him now being recognized again, which is not an aspect of the film, but in the book he's been recognized. He knows he's only got, and I can't remember how long the clock ticks down now. Something like maybe that happens in the morning, and by the evening he's out of there. The clock
Yeah.
he's got to get through lunch, and he knows he's being watched. And again, I felt the energy of it's sort of the definition of a page turn. I thought it was brilliantly constructed. He has to gather up the goggles, and he has to gather up the gloves, and he's got to have these kind of ways of getting them. I think is it from Irma Bunt? He says he needs some gloves and goggles, and it's this lovely sense of that the clock is ticking. By midnight they're going to come and get you. You're dead.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also that speaks to the sort of the limited ambitions of the mission. It's like, I've got my information, bye. It's not
Yeah.
like I've got to set the charges for 12:30 for half past midnight so I can blow the place up. It's like, no, I'm just going to go back and report the intelligence I've gathered. And you
And
could
he gets all the girls' names, doesn't he? And writes them down. So yeah, he's done his job. He's got the names, and yeah, as I say, he's out of there.
yeah, he's written them down in we.
Well, I will. I think we'll come to that. I found an interesting fact about that, but maybe at the very end, we'll reflect on that.
Becomes a little bit of a just sort of a comedy Bond moment of, wash your hands
Yeah,
when you finished with that, because it's
please,
yeah.
yes.
And then there's a thing about how much alcohol is in there.
Yeah, no, they tested it for uric acid and said you have been warned.
Then there's a sort of return. He again, the eternal return. He can't leave anywhere. He has to keep coming back. So he has to save Tracy and
Yes.
destroy the plant. And I mean, Gloria Pitts as a setting as well has this. I mean, in many of the, I mean, this is something Umberto Eco loved about the books, was that he saw them as fairy tales. And
Mm.
there are actual castles in You Only Live Twice. There's an actual castle, and this Gloria Piz is really, it's a mountaintop castle, really. It's like a little
Yeah.
bit reminiscent of Hitler's sort of retreat.
But that's a very good point. Yeah, you're looking at Bond going up to this mountain retreat. There is the monster up there. He's got to
Mm,
get something and get out of there like a knight. Going to
mm.
grab an artifact of some kind.
And then he has to go and sort of release the damsel. And just one, hopefully, well, no, not the last reference, surely, but the dialogue in terms of the helicopters that we've already established where they've come from, that Draco gains to go. That dialogue is just word for word what's in the film. That whole thing about
Yeah,
there are members of the press here. I'm sure they'll be pleased to
yeah.
know why the Red Cross is not being allowed. And they're using like real news items. There's been this cable car accident, and we're going to transfer blood from this place to this place. It's just so it feels very much ripped from the headlines, as they say.
And again, this is coming back to maybe one of the comments I made at the beginning. The film is the one that it hews so closely to this book. It is sometimes hard to sort of really come to terms with analyzing this book without having it reflected through the prism of the film, which is quite nice to do this podcast actually and come back actually remember what's brilliant about the book is what made a brilliant film. It's the book that's brilliant first.
Yeah, I don't think all the books would necessarily transfer that well and that easily. I think this is like very,
Mm.
very much one of the ones that does. But having read all of the books almost now, well, having read them all in the past and having almost finished my reread, it's so interesting to see even the books which haven't been translated onto screen faithfully, that aspects of them pop up repeatedly in the
Mm.
films, not necessarily in the same films or the films with the same name, but there's so many bits that they've obviously gone back and thought we need to do that scene. That scene is really good,
Mm.
which speaks to Ian Fleming's ability to write a good, and the battle here, the fight at the top of the mountain is
Yeah.
is cracking, and as you say, like with the avalanche, it's a real page turner.
Yeah. And the ski chase, we've got two, I think, incredibly well-written chases. The ski chase itself, where they're coming after him and they're on the cable car and they're dropping grenades and they're firing guns at him. But you really get inside Bond's head about actually how absolutely painful the wind is on the face and how excruciating doing this is on your legs.
Mm.
And it's just so wonderfully a really cold, brutal, chilly experience. And the bobsleigh's the same. This bobsleigh chase. We've been told in no uncertain terms how deadly it is because one of the henchmen gets thrown down it as a punishment, and he's bounced around so much he's dead within about 20 seconds. And those details add to that tension. So when Bond is herring off after Blofeld, you really feel, I did anyway, every single bump and turn of this chase. Wonderful stuff, absolutely wonderful writing.
Yeah, I totally agree. It totally matches in excitement the movie,
Mm.
and you just really feel the danger. And I think one thing that the books really have as well is there's a sense that of exhaustion with Bond. There are bits in this where he's like, well, when he meets Tracy and he says, "I'm done in, I'm finished. I can't
Yeah.
if they come for me now, I can't raise my arms. I'm not able to defend myself." And that happens time and again, where he can feel his extremities freezing, and he just knows that its tasks will be beyond him. He's not the supermensch, mensch that you'd have
Mm.
in any action movie. He's not going to sort of get up from the deck and with a final ounce of energy do something.
No.
He's when he knows when he's done, and that yeah, even here
Well,
there's he doesn't get to the villain. The villain gets away.
absolutely. And that lovely moment of absolute exhaustion. It's so beautifully rendered on the book where Tracy's, picked him up, got him back to the airport. He's had finally his scrambled eggs, but he gets onto the plane. Yes, page 219 in my edition. Fantastic. But he gets on the plane and he's absolutely in pieces, physically absolutely drained. And I think this comes back, John, to what you were saying at the beginning of, this is a man who's not got many missions left in him, not only mentally, but literally physically as well.
Yeah, no, totally. And he's and I think really from this one on, you're seeing Bond. It's, I mean, I don't want to jump too far ahead, especially if people are reading, are following these episodes and reading the
Mm.
books. But you see a dramatic decline in Bond, and you see a dramatic increase in his drinking, and things like mental health will play a major role in You Only Live Twice and in The Man from the Golden Gun, which are the two remaining novels that I'll be looking at.
I'm guessing, John, is this, in part to do with Fleming's decline? Do you think? He didn't he get his health warning round about the time of was on Majesty's Secret Service, or was it during the writing of
It
You Only
was
Live Twice? But he
it
he he was on the decline himself, wasn't he?
he had a heart attack during the I think it was after he wrote Thunderball. So it was immediately prior to
Oh,
this, between this one and sorry, yes, no, the Spy Who Loved Me came in between, but after Thunderball, he had
right.
a heart attack, which was a direct result, or was at least there was the suggestion that it was because of the law case that went again with him or against him with that
Was this?
with a book with the Kevin McClory case you referred
Oh,
to.
McCloy.
Yeah, because he'd
Yes.
essentially, I mean, they were right. They'd all got together and wrote a film's treatment. And when the film didn't happen, he thought, well, I'll just use that treatment to write my book. And you can't do that without crediting people. So it should have been something that had been resolved long before the book ever saw the light of day. I think the stress of that, going back to him not having that much money, or at least not as much money as you might think, a big legal case um, is going to
Mm,
drain your coffers very, very quickly. You could soon find all the money you've earned disappearing into lawyers' fees.
yeah.
And a case you could very credibly lose. So I think there's an element that he was facing something like financial ruin, and the heart attack were nobody ever recovers from a heart attack. A heart attack is something which weakens your heart. So especially at this point in his life, he knew he was on sort of borrowed time. The cigarettes and the alcohol were not helping, and obviously not. And so, yeah, I do feel that there is a sense that he has deaths, deaths nearby, and he will mention that there's a phrase that comes up in the subsequent books where he will repeatedly use "death had entered the room," and I feel that that isn't just a glib genre way of heightening tension. I think there's an element that Fleming himself had felt death had entered the room for him too. Um, and these books are in some sense are in a way of dealing with that, of combating, but also addressing it. And so
I
we
like the
get.
phrase
Sorry, go ahead.
borrowed time. I like the phrase you said, borrowed time. There's a sense of that with this book, I
And
think.
of course, this probably
Yeah.
is the book with the most consequential death in it of all, since
Yeah.
Vesper Lind. You know, Vesper Lind, you've already had that, him having the stuffing knocked out of him as a young man. And I keep using this phrase, which probably is, I'm using it incorrectly, the eternal return, but isn't this just happening all over again? Isn't it? He's fallen in
Mm.
love with a woman, and he's been visiting the graveyard of his former love. He's allowed himself to love this woman. She loves him. She's perfect for him. He foresees a life. You know, he actually sort of plans out his life with her. She's not a
Well,
tip.
he really, yeah, he really does love her. He's planning where they might live. He's planning how many kids they're going to have, and even though he turns down Draco's money, he does hint at some point, well, maybe if we need a cottage in the country, we'll take some of it. So, he's really serious about this. And it's something, I mean, if we're looking at Casino Royale, was it 55? And then this book is 62, or is it 63, John? Can't remember.
I think it was written in 61, but it came out later. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're talking about Bond, fairly, he's lost one love of his life, and then the second love of his life is brutally slain. It is pretty horrific stuff for a person to go through, twice.
Yes, you're right. It's 63. It is 63, that
Okay,
it was
yeah.
published. And that slaying, the last two pages of this book are, reach levels of emotional engagement that anybody who hasn't read a James Bond novel, I would kind of challenge them to read those last two pages, and it's fine writing. It's really well written.
Mm,
It's really
yeah,
touching. The details, the policeman turning up, him sort of talking to her and saying, "No, she's just resting," and the way you're
yeah,
misdirected, it's superb. And it's no surprise that when they came to film it, they film it exactly as it's written.
yeah. It again, beat for beat,
Yeah.
we have all the time in the world comes in as that final line. And yeah, it's devastating stuff for essentially, a crime thriller. But I think having said that, it's almost as if the book tees us up for it. That it does seem to me, looking back on it now, the book is tinged with a reflectiveness and a melancholy and a chilliness that maybe this ending isn't surprising. It's still devastating, but maybe it's the ending that it needed to be.
Mm.
Maybe I'd love to know what you think about this, John. Maybe Fleming felt, well, Bond isn't really going to settle down. So he's either going to walk away from her, she's going to walk away from him, or in this case, she gets killed. So maybe this is the ending that it just had to have.
Yeah, yeah. And what's interesting, I think, is that the subsequent two novels that come after aren't like he's back in the saddle, They are he's screwed, and
Mm,
there's nothing that will rescue him. And M is essentially saying, okay, do we have any suicidal missions for him? Because he's not going to be any good to us otherwise. We to give
mm.
him something suicidal that either it'll kill him, or if he succeeds, well, it's a win-win situation for us. And that is a remarkable sort of way of treating your character. It's you don't you could see a lesser writer thinking, well, this is where his reserves of stoicism come in, but they're not there. He's depleted. He's gone. He's finished as a person, as a human being.
Yeah.
And in fact, his very identity in the last two novels will be so fractured that you won't, as a reader, be able to trust whether you're really reading about James Bond anymore.
So this is almost
This
Bond at the end of kind of his sort of arc, and he's just a broken creature after
this
this, I feel.
I would argue, and I'm arguing it with all the confidence of someone who's just thought of it, that this could this could be termed the last James Bond novel, because I think You Only Live
Yeah.
Twice. He's kind of gone, and he's kind of
Mm.
hiding. He's playing hide and seek to some degree, and he gets lost. And then the Man with the Golden Gun is, I mean, obviously it's a book that Fleming didn't finish and Kingsley Amis did. So, how far we can consider it, properly speaking, a Bond novel, Ian Fleming Bond
Mm,
novel, is open to debate. But it's also a book which starts with Bond trying to kill M, which in a
that's
way,
right.
like you said, it's one of those things which is surprising but not shocking, or shocking but not surprising. It's like, of course, this is where we've been heading all along. That devotion and
Mm,
that love that he has for this austere man who seems utterly undeserving of it. Of course, it should end with him wanting to kill him in an Oedipal sort of
mm,
manner. That's perfect. So
yeah.
yeah. But I've
Yeah.
only just thought of that, so I might not ask me again in a couple of days. I might not agree with that.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? And I suppose we'll never really know the answer to this, but I remember when I did read them back. Well, I say I read them for the first time in 2004. It did feel like the last one. And whilst there's a lot of validity and interest in the other two, I'm wondering if they were almost a petering out of that character. But again, it's hard to say. The films were starting to kick in, but his health was declining, so he wasn't really able to sort of actually maybe capitalize on the success and resurrect the character. So maybe the character had to be almost kind of written into this sort of self-destructive, hole that he went down. So maybe it's just
Mm.
logical it had to go that way, possibly.
Yeah, no, I mean, You Only Live Twice famously finishes on his obituary. So, it there a surprising number of the novels end with a kind of false death for Bond, with him sort of collapsing and the Russia with Love, the carpet swallows
Yes.
him,
He's been poisoned, hasn't he, with the shoe, is it? Yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. And there's a few where he what is it? Is it Thunderball? He's unconscious and he wakes up in hospital. There's several where he's unconscious and he wakes up in hospital. Often saved by the girl in
Yes.
direct contradiction to how the films will portray. And why I would contend that the books, for all their medieval sexism, are in some ways actually much more progressive than the films,
Yeah, I think that, yeah.
because
Yeah, yeah,
Bond is
yeah.
so passive and so in need of being rescued.
Yeah.
He's just looking for someone to rescue him. So let's
Yeah.
Ian, as a way of closing our conversation, what have we learned about Bond from this book?
I think we're looking at Bond almost at the end of a sort of character arc. I felt again, I try not to calculate the age because again, you can become a bit too precise with these things. But I got the sense of a man who was really kind of bored with this now and is slightly damaged physically and mentally. And when he sees a kindred spirit, wants to be with her. Now, we've got the mission in the background of that, but that to me is where I felt we were with this character. This is Bond, tiring, tired mentally and physically, seeing the person like him and wanting to get the cottage in the country and a flat in Belgravia and maybe get behind the desk.
He sees an off ramp to his sort of career, and
Yeah,
is not allowed to take it. And I mean, we're kind of guilty as well, because as a readership, we don't want him to get married. We don't want these books to stop.
absolutely not. This is the wonderful, the great addiction to, as you say, you referenced Lee Child earlier. You wouldn't want Jack Reacher to suddenly stop. You want to read the next one. You want to read the next one after that. So again, there's a real sense of him sort of being trapped in this role, and yeah, I felt I was reading a very kind of melancholy character who is actually still doing his duty but was so glad to get out, but of course devastated when he found he couldn't.
A really mature novel by Fleming, one that still has the excitement and the kicks and everything you want from a James
Mm.
Bond book, but at the same time, there's a real sense that, especially if we've read them chronologically, as we have done with this podcast, a sense that we're really getting to as you say, an end point, a moment
Mm,
that it's a little bit like with those great HBO TV shows that sort of when you get to the end of the season, it's not the last episode. It's always the penultimate two episodes, which are the real sort of dramatic peaks, and then the next two or
yeah.
one episode are sort of wrapping up the loose ends or dealing with the fallout, you know. And that's what this feels like to me. This feels like the dramatic heights of the series.
I think it's certainly, it feels like a real high point, coming off The Spy Loved Me, which was an experiment, Thunderball, which again one could argue was written with others, that maybe he's kind of really coming back and getting his mojo.
Mm,
But this is the last that I've got as a writer. This is Bond and me coming to the end. And maybe it's all the better for that.
mm,
He knows, maybe even as a writer, we're coming to the last stages of this character. He can't stay young forever, although technically those, Sherlock Holmes and Jack Reacher appear to.
mm.
Um,
The
but
Patrick
yeah,
O'Brian books as well. Yeah,
yeah.
The Napoleonic
Um,
War lasts for like 40 years.
so yeah, to me, this is why it's been such a pleasure to talk about it. It does feel like the creative high point, and that Fleming here had something in his sails. I think not only plot wise and not only in the prose, but I think in terms of the character. I think
Mm,
it ticks all three boxes
mm.
perfectly for me.
Yeah, the an extra gust is laid on by the fact that he's seeing his character actually embodied in a in a Hollywood production that
And
will
yeah, yeah,
assure him of further sort of exposure, and boost his book sales. People are going to go back and
yeah,
start
absolutely.
reading
Yeah,
Doctor No now
yeah,
and all the rest. Brilliant,
yeah.
Ian.
That's
Well,
got to have an impact. Yeah. No,
absolutely.
yeah. Thank you.
Listen, it's been so good talking to you about this book. It's been a real. There's been so many points that you've made that it's just a joy talking Bond with someone who has passion and enthusiasm the way you do. So thank you so much, and good luck with the bunker.
Thank you, John. It's been a real pleasure to talk through this book again. It's been a while since I've read it, but a joy to come back to it. I'd forgotten really how good it was. So thank you. Thank you for having me on.